Hi, Lakeview. I'm Janelyn. I'm your senior high pastor, and welcome to this week's installment of Interruption, the story of Joseph on welcoming disruption and resisting control. So, this week we're going to see that we can't always trust the framework that DreamWorks provides us with. They're not going to give us the whole picture. We're going to recognize that disruptions cause a variety of different responses, and then at the very end, we're going to be left waiting. So when I was young, I used to go out to my grandma's house in Leask for a week every summer. She had this big, beautiful oak tree that had a swing hanging from it that I used to spend so much time on. She had a huge garden, and we'd pick raspberries and pull potatoes and carrots and eat fresh from the garden. We'd make cookies, and we'd watch her stories, mainly Bold and the Beautiful. Grandma usually got to pick what was on TV, but there was once a week when we would go to Oshega's, this tiny little greasy spoon, video arcade, poutine serving diner that also rented movies. And my grandma was always a really good sport, and she watched everything that I wanted to rent, from Fern Gully to the very first Lord of the Rings. She didn't really like that one. But one time we went there, and I found a movie that I had never even knew existed, and it was called Joseph, King of Dreams. It was the DreamWorks follow-up to the very successful Prince of Egypt, which I loved. Great soundtrack. So naturally, I wanted to rent that. So as you're watching this movie, you get introduced to Joseph, this kind, misunderstood young man. You get introduced to Israel, this doting father, and then you also get introduced to this band of jealous brothers. And right away, you know who you're supposed to empathize with and who you're meant to dislike. Joseph gets sold into slavery, and your distaste for the brothers is definitely cemented. How could they ever have any sort of, redeeming qualities to them? You mourn for Israel as his heart breaks, and you feel for him. And then Joseph rises to power in Potiphar's house, in prison after he's wrongly accused, and in the nation of Egypt after he interprets Pharaoh's dreams about famine. Joseph is the underdog, the Cinderella of this story, and we are on his side. And then after he rises to power, who shows up but his brothers begging for food because there's a famine in their land as well. And then Joseph sends them back to go get his brother Benjamin, proving that they're not spies, and holds Simeon captive as he waits for them to come back. But as we've gone through this series for longer and longer, my DreamWorks delusion of this story has become a little less clear. Because I used to know who the good guys were and the bad guys were when I watched the movie. Joseph was the good guy. His brothers were the bad guys, and Israel was just a broken-hearted father. But as we've gone through the series and we see some of the arrogance of Joseph and some of the negative traits of his brothers and his father, and even some of the positive traits of his brothers, I got frustrated because when the world feels like it's ending, it would be at least nice to know who's on the right team, right? But instead of deciding who is right and who is wrong in this scenario, I want to look at the three main players in this section. And maybe we'll get some insight into the variety of responses that crop up in us when our lives are disrupted. And how maybe, just maybe, we might be guilty of placing people into categories as yet another means of exercising control over ourselves and others. So we'll start reading in Genesis 43. If you want to crack open your Bible and follow along, I'm going to be skipping around just a little bit, but I'd love to have you read along with me. So the famine got worse. When they had eaten all the food they had brought back from Egypt, their father said, "Go back and get more food." But Judah said, "The man warned us most emphatically, 'You won't see as much as my face if you don't have your brother with you. If you're ready to release our brother to go with us, we'll go down and get you food. But if you're not ready, we're not going. What would be the use? The man told us, 'You won't see my face if you don't have your brother with you.'" Israel responded, "Why are you making my life so difficult? Why did you even tell the man you had a brother?" Judah pushed his father Israel, "Let the boy go. I'll take charge of him. Let us go and be on our way. If we don't get going, we're all going to starve to death, we and you and our children. I'll take full responsibility for his safety. It's my life on the line for his. If I don't bring him back safe and sound, I'm the guilty one. I'll take all the blame. If we could have gone ahead in the first place instead of procrastinating like this, we could have been there and back twice over." Their father Israel gave in. "If it has to be, it has to be, but do this. Stuff your packs with the finest products from the land so that you can take them to this man as gifts. some balm, some honey, some spices, some perfume, some pistachios and almonds. Take plenty of money. Pay back double what was returned to you in your sacks. That might have been a mistake. Take your brother and get going. Go back to the man. And may the strong God give you grace in that man's eyes so that he'll send back your brother along with your brother Benjamin. And for me, nothing is left. I've lost everything. Now, before we get too deep into thinking about Israel and Judah's exchange here, I just want to set up a little bit of a framework for us that will help us better understand what it looks like when we are trying to embrace disruptions and resist control. Now, in times of disruption, people will either move towards places of security or places of stress. Another way to put it is that when people find their lives interrupted, they either move to a place of vice or of virtue. These vices and virtues are patterns that we've developed over the years to help us cope with difficult situations. So a vice would usually look like you trying to disconnect from yourself, from others. These are more unconscious strategies that we develop just to get by. They're masks that we put on to protect ourselves from our own emotions and from others. Now, virtues, those look like us being honest with ourselves. They look like us being our best selves. This looks like us living up to who God created us to be. Being virtuous is being emotionally aware and honest and vulnerable. Now, as we go through the rest of this message, I want you to use this framework of vices and virtues to get a sense of how people in this story are either resisting control or clinging to control. So, we might have assumed that Jacob, or Israel as he's now named, is the pillar of his family, the one who God's nation is named after, would have been leaning far towards the virtue side of things. But if we take a closer look at his response to his brothers wanting to take Benjamin, his favorite son, to Egypt, looks like he might be leaning a little bit more towards the vice side of things. So as we take a look at this here, we see selfishness. Why are you making my life so difficult? He's being dishonest. Why did you even tell him you had another brother? He's manipulating, trying to smooth things over with money and gifts, and he's being fatalist. For me, there's nothing left. I've lost everything. I'm sure the other 10 sons really love to hear that. But in the middle of all this, we see a small cropping up of virtue, this essence of being dependent on God. Because after everything is stripped away, Israel says this, and may the strong God give you grace. So this isn't the first time we've seen Israel act this way. We've seen him be selfish before. We saw him steal Esau's birthright when he was younger. We've seen him be dishonest. He tricked his father Isaac to thinking he was Esau so he would give him his blessing. We've seen him manipulate people with gifts and money by smoothing things over with Esau and sending money ahead in case he was really, really mad at him. These are patterns that Israel has used to get through difficult situations time and time again. And we also see fear, laziness, and favoritism as other vices that crop up in this situation. But we do get a glimpse into his capacity for virtue. He relinquishes control and trusts God to bring his family back home safe. Not just Benjamin, his favorite, but Simeon, who's been left in prison in Egypt for far too long, and the rest of his family. So, we've seen both sides of Israel's response, the vices and the virtue. Now let's take a look at Judah. Judah is the fourth oldest in his family, and he steps up to the plate after Reuben, who is the oldest, has a failed attempt at convincing Israel that they need to go back by offering up his 2 sons as collateral if they fail. Again, thanks a lot, Dad. We see the patterns of brokenness through this family over and over again. But Judah decides that he needs to take on a role of leadership in his family as one of the oldest sons because he wants to be responsible. So we see these types of responses. We see vice in Judah for sure, because he's manipulating his father, because he says that Joseph said, "You won't so much see my face if you don't have your brother with you." What he actually left out was the, "You will be executed and so will your brother Simeon if you come back without Benjamin." It's kind of this idea of half-truths where it doesn't really feel like you're hurting anybody, but you're definitely not telling the truth. I used to do this when I was younger. I would tell my parents that I was going to stay at my friend's house, and I was staying at their friend's house, but maybe it was their house that was 2.5 hours away, not the one that was just down the street. Or, maybe you tell a half-truth where you tell part of the truth so you don't hurt anyone's feelings. It's still manipulation no matter what. But he also has so many virtues that pop up here. He's courageous. He pushes his father, which is a really difficult thing to do, especially when your dad is so much older than you and wiser than you, and you're in a culture that really values hierarchy. He also demonstrates leadership. He says, let the boy go and I'll take charge of him. And he's responsible. He puts his own safety, his own life on the line if something happens to Benjamin. So in this story, as I said, we see some of the unhealthy patterns that Israel has used to cope, that he's taught his boys to use to cope, and these vices have been rooted in this family for a really long time. But as their conversation unfolds, we also see the beginnings of virtue that have long since been absent from these families as these patterns begin to break. So now the brothers are off with Benjamin, their gifts and their money in tow to Egypt to get more grain and bring back their brother Simeon. When they arrive, Joseph sees them from afar and tells his steward to pick them up and take them to his house for a meal. Only problem is that the brothers don't know about this and they panic big time. They remember how hostile and belligerent Joseph was before, and now they assume that they've been called into his house for who knows what, probably to be executed. They think they're in a heap of trouble. So they try to explain away the mistake with the money that they had in their packs, and they get a confusing answer from Joseph's steward. And then Simeon is brought out, and they are reunited. They're welcomed into Joseph's home, their animals are fed, their feet are washed, and the brothers now wait for Joseph, who they don't know is Joseph, with their display of gifts. What an emotional afternoon. When Joseph got home, they presented him with the gifts that they had brought and bowed respectfully before him. Is that ringing any bells? Joseph then welcomed them and said, "And your father, of whom you mentioned to me, how is he? Is he still alive?" And they said, "Yes, your servant, our father, is quite well and very much alive." And then they bowed again respectfully before him. Then Joseph picked out his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, and he asked, "And this is your youngest brother that you told me about?" And then he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved on seeing his brother and about to burst into tears, Joseph hurried into another room and had a good cry. Then he washed his face, got a grip on himself, and said, "Let's eat." Joseph was served at his private table, the brothers by themselves and the Egyptians off by themselves. Egyptians wouldn't eat at the same table with Hebrews. It was repulsive to them. The brothers were seated facing Joseph, arranged in order of their age, the oldest to the youngest. They looked at each other wide-eyed, wondering what would happen next. When the brothers' plates were served from Joseph's table, Benjamin's plate came piled high, far more than the rest of his brothers. And so the brothers feasted with Joseph, drinking freely. We see Joseph exhibiting some of these similar patterns and habits and vices that he's learned from his family. He too takes the opportunity to manipulate his family by piling Benjamin's plate so high in order to see how they'll react when he is shown favor over them. But he's also experienced a lot of hardship, a lot of interruptions, as we have seen over the last several weeks. And these interruptions have helped him to lean into these ideas of breaking the cycles and inserting virtues where vices would normally take place. He shows hospitality. He has dinner with them. He gives them water to wash their feet and feed their donkeys. He's kind. He says, "God be gracious to you, my son," to his brother Benjamin. And he has compassion. He's deeply moved by seeing his brother, and it moves him to tears. And that's where we're left. The dominoes are set up, and we have to wait yet another week to see how this will unfold. We leave this passage asking, did Israel really have faith that God would bring his family home? Or was that a last-ditch effort because they were starving? Did Judah really change? Or did he just want to go get some food because he's super hungry? Did Joseph actually forgive his brothers? Or is he setting them up for an elaborate trap? I think the thing that made me the most uncomfortable with this passage was the ambiguity. At the end of all this, the playing field all of a sudden feels so much more leveled. Those who are expected to exude virtue cling to their vices. And those who are supposed to be virtuous start poking holes in things by acting poorly. The villains of this story, the ones who contributed to the chaos and pain of this family, the brothers, are able to take massive strides of progress to a place of leading, to loyalty and humility in their family. The perceived hero of the story, the one who's grown and changed so much, finds himself in places of regression and picking up old habits of testing and manipulating others. Things appear to just have gotten quite a bit messier. And honestly, I think this reminds me of a book that I've read recently called The Coddling of the American Mind. The premise of the book is that there are three great untruths cropping up in the minds of North Americans, particularly in young North Americans, and they are as follows. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. In that estimation, there is no point and no purpose to suffering. Always trust your feelings, no matter what. Never, ever question them. Your feelings are always right. And lastly, the life is a battle between good and evil people. And we are to decide who is who. And I see snippets of all these untruths popping up in this story in one way or another, but I think that my DreamWorks delusion that I've experienced about who is good and who is bad makes this last one, the life is a battle between good and evil people, the most prominent for me. Because we like the simplicity that people are good or they are bad, and there is nothing in between. We want to say Israel's good. We want to feel nothing but sympathy for him because he's gone through something really traumatic. But as we notice, he has plenty of vices alongside his virtues. We want to cast the brothers in the role of the villains in the story because they've done horrible things. But in this particular story, we see Judah make big time progress towards reconciliation with his family. We want to root for Joseph, the underdog of this story who's been wronged, but we also realize that he's not perfect either. So what we end up doing is we take it upon ourselves to separate the sheep from the goats without stopping to realize that there are vices and virtues present in every single one of us. And this is how we exercise yet another measure of control. But this passage shows us that when we start really paying attention, that it's not so cut and dry. And our DreamWorks delusion of who is good and who is bad and what role they play gets dismantled very quickly. It's funny how I find myself preaching about disruptions and resisting control when I have found myself, as I'm sure many of us did, in a season where all I wanted was to feel like I was in control. But this week, especially in particular, as I've been ramping up to share this message with you, I have found myself in a very disrupted place. Because of unforeseen circumstances, we ended up moving this year, and in the midst of all of this, I don't even know where my own car keys are half the time. So as I feel disrupted, as I feel very out of control, I have seen my own personal vices pop up in really big ways. For me, that looks like binge watching Netflix to escape, worrying or overexerting myself to feel like I'm somewhat in control of my surroundings so maybe I can find my car keys one day. But in the midst of all of my vices, and trust me, there are many, I have been able to see some virtue shine through in myself that I would not have exercised if my life looked differently in this season. I've been able to practice gratitude daily. I've sought out to be really, really present in my social situations. And I have taken time to just sit and be with God and not try to accomplish anything for him. So this week, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I know that Allison has a spiritual practice video up as well, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of homework too. Take stock of your responses. Just yours, not others. And what are the way that vices, the masks that you are wearing to distance yourself from others and yourself, are showing up? What are the ways that your virtues are showing up? When are you able to be your authentic self that you were created to be? When are you able to be emotionally aware of yourself and others and your relationship with God? And beyond keeping score of your vices and virtues this week, and of the vices and virtues of others, because you will be tempted to while you're paying attention to your own, I want you to remember to extend grace to yourself and others. And to finish off our time together, I'd like to read you this poem by Holiday Phillips called A Love Letter to Humanity, in hopes that it will inspire us to see each other as whole people who are riddled with vices and brimming with virtues, and that the delusion of the us versus them mentality might be dismantled. Show me your darkest corners, and I will love you there. Take me to all of the places you've hidden from the world, the places where you're too bad, too dirty, too loud, too big, wherever you are too much or not enough. I will love you there. Spare me the hard shell of your perfection. I want to see the soft flesh of your heart. every failure, every bad thought or worse deed, the ones you barely dare to whisper in the dead of night when no one is around. Guide me to the dusty cupboard where you have stored your shame in hope that the light of prying eyes would never catch its sight, where the prejudices, the perversions, the lies, and the guilt live. And the most shameful thought that makes your heart race and your palms sweat for the slightest chance that they can see it in your eyes or read it on your lips. Even there, I will love you. Show me your darkest corners, and I will love you there. For I know that your darkest corners are also mine. Will you meet me there and love me too? God, you are so good. You are so good, and we, though we try, are not always good. We can't live up to the perfection of your Son who died for us. And I pray that as we have a theology that says that we are all broken, that we would be gracious when people live into that, when they live up to our expectations of not being perfect. I pray that you would help us to be gracious with ourselves as we learn where we exhibit vices and where we shine through virtues that reflect who you are. And I pray that we would take stock of that this week and learn where we can become more like you and celebrate where we are being like you, and that we would just love each other and not cast each other into specific roles and categories based on politics, religion, race, or socioeconomic status. Lord, you love all of us despite our shortcomings. And I pray that this week we would be aware of that so that we can love others despite their shortcomings and love ourselves despite our own shortcomings. We pray all this in your holy and precious name. Amen. And with that, love God, love others, tell this story, and we'll see you next week.